My name is Hunscher-Young. I'm a Stoneleigh Junior Fellow at Research for Action in Philadelphia. This is a presentation that I did at the 2011 Ethnography and Education Conference at the University of Pennsylvania on February 25th, 2011. And so, as a Stoneleigh Junior Fellow at Research for Action, what I'm doing is working on a year-long project looking at after-school programs for adolescents that use media literacy as a core part of their programming, trying to figure out how this new form of literacy connects to traditional forms of literacy and what they do for young people today. But before I really get into the specifics of my study, I wanted to talk a little bit more, just give you a quick overview of what I'm going to go through in today's presentation. So first, give you a little bit of background about where I'm coming from. Then I'm going to go into my research questions, talk about my methodology, go over some preliminary findings from my research, and then offer a couple of further questions based on what I've found so far. So we all know that our world is changing, right? There's new forms of technology, new forms of communication, tweeting, emailing, all of these different forms that people need to be literate in. You need to understand them in order to succeed in life, right? And that's especially true among the younger generation. So a study by the Pew Institute in 2008 said that 85% of teens communicate electronically at least occasionally. So that included things like emailing, text messaging, using social networking sites, things like that. And I'm sure that percentage has probably increased in the last 3 years since that study was conducted. That same study, however, found that 60% of the same teens do not think of these texts as writing. So even though they are writing words and they're conveying messages on things like Facebook or through text messages, they don't think of those as writing. Writing is something different to them. And so I think what this reflects is that in our society we've adapted and we understand that there's this new form of communication. You know, we're all okay with the fact that cell phones, email, tweeting, all of these things are new ways to communicate, and we understand that. But when we think about writing, we still think very traditionally, right? We think about writing in terms of sitting down and actually putting words onto paper in paragraph form most often. And so I think that points to most of society still having a fairly traditional idea of literacy. So traditional literacy being reading and writing in print forms. But with our new communication, I think we also need to really recognize that literacy is also changing along with communication, right? So literacy is about conveying ideas and messages and understanding those, right? Reading and writing is about understanding ideas or messages, and then writing or creating them and conveying them to another audience. So specifically what I was looking at in terms of new literacies is media literacy, which is reading and writing with media. So instead of reading a book, they read by listening to a radio piece. Instead of writing a 5-paragraph essay, they write by creating a video or a podcast, something like that. This is how the young people that I was working with were using new media to convey messages. They were literate in these new forms of media. So with that in mind, my research questions, I had 3 main research questions, I guess. And so the first one was, how do adolescents learn and master media literacy skills? So what's the actual way that they learn these? How does instruction happen in these programs? 2, why do youth engage in programs that teach these skills? So what is it that motivates them to come and stay in these programs that they're volunteering their time for? And 3, what does this mean for education and educators both in and outside of schools? So trying to figure out what this means and how we can really effectively engage young people in their learning. And so to look at those questions, I worked at 2 different sites, the Philadelphia Student Union and Chester Voices for Change. The Philadelphia Student Union, or PSU, is a long-standing youth organizing group in Philadelphia that's focused on empowering young people to create change in education. It's also youth-led. So what that means is that young people from middle school through, college are working together on organizing projects. So they're focused on creating change in the Philadelphia education system. So they organize actions and things like that. They have campaigns. Their current campaign is about nonviolent schools, which is a really important issue in Philadelphia. And along with all of these organizing efforts, they also produce their own media as a way to support that organizing, as a way to both document what they're doing and also share knowledge about what they're doing. And so they have a video production team, they have a written newsletter that goes out, they have a music production program, but I focused on their radio production program called On Blast, which produces both pieces for podcasts online as well as hosting a live radio show about once a month on a local low power radio station, WPEB in West Philadelphia. The other program is Chester Voices for Change, which I started and ran as an undergraduate at Swarthmore College. And so this is based in Chester, which is just about 15 miles south of Philadelphia. This program, in contrast to PSU, was much more of a media production, media literacy kind of program. It was focused on positive youth development and community exploration and engagement through video production specifically. So trying to help young people in Chester become positive young adults by engaging them in film production. In terms of methodology, this was a qualitative study, so I used participant observation as well as interviews with the young people, all of which were transcribed and whatnot, as is typical in ethnographic research. But at the two sites, because of the different relationships that I had with each program, they called for sort of different forms of methodology. So at PSU, what I did was interpretive research, which is long-term research with deliberate reflection. So I was there for about 7 months. I did some general observations to kind of get a sense of what the whole organization is like before zeroing in on radio and figuring out how radio specifically works within the larger context of the Philadelphia Student Union. Also in this case, if we think of participant observation as a spectrum with participant on one side and observer on the other, at PSU I was much more of an observer than a participant. I sat outside of the circles, rarely sort of participated in the activities, and was focused on diligently taking notes throughout the process. And then I would go back later and transcribe those notes and add in reflections about, what I thought was important, what relationships I saw developing, things like that. In contrast, at Voices for Change in Chester, I used action research, which is a form of reflective research, right? So that was because I was running the program. I had run it once as an undergraduate as a summer program, and then I was running it for the second time in the fall of 2010 as an after-school program. And I was in charge of the daily activities, trying to make sure everything ran, working with young people, making sure that they learned how to make a video. And so action research really made sense for me to use in this case because it's a form of research done by practitioners where you identify some key questions, sort of reflect and investigate those, try some things out, adjust your practice, and then go back and keep researching and keep adjusting consistently. In addition, at VFC, I was much more of a participant than an observer, clearly, because I was in charge of the program and had to take care of things every day for that. A couple of questions that I had about my position at each site that I don't know that I'll actually be able to answer, but I think are important to note. So one, I was thinking about how my identities affect relationships and the data collection in that process, so specifically thinking about my role as a young adult. Recognizing that I am only a few months or a few years older than some of the students that I was working with, and trying to figure out how their perception of me as both a young person but also an adult, how that may have affected what they were willing to share with me, what they understood my role as in the organization, things like that. Probably affected, what they shared with me in the interviews and things like that. In addition, in both cases, I was a community outsider, so I had to sort of establish myself as a credible person to come in. So I did that at both organizations by connecting with key members of the community. So at PSU, that was with the executive director as well as the radio coordinator. And in Chester, I worked with community partners, and they really helped to sort of set me up in the community. But again, being an outsider, I wonder how the young people saw me, what they thought about sharing, personal things about issues in the city or things like that with me as a researcher. The second question was about my positions within the program. So I already talked about being a participant versus an observer at VFC versus PSU, and I talked a little bit about how that might have affected things. But in addition, at VFC, for some of the students, I think I became more of a mentor, and at PSU, I was seen as a researcher, right? Because at PSU, my only role was to research the organization. I was introduced as someone who was conducting research, but in VFC, I was an instructor first and a researcher second, and I sort of became a mentor for a lot of the kids, talking to them about some more personal problems and things like that. And so that might have affected what they were, what they were willing to share with me and how they viewed the program as well and what they wanted to voice about it, whether that was criticism or support for the program.